So this is Williams's Catholic Bells, and we have a 1955 recording of this on our syllabus, and we're reading it in the Whitmanian vein. So we've come to Williams many times together as coming out of the Whitman tradition. But I'm interested in reading this poem as meta-poetic. So I want us to think about how to do a close reading that would get us to the meta-poetics of the piece. It seems very Whitmanian, and maybe that's obvious to you, or maybe it's not, but maybe that's something we can explore together. But let's try to force ourselves to find something meta-poetic about it. So Williams reads this poem very late in life at his home in Rutherford, New Jersey, just a few years before his death. He's already suffered from 2 strokes, so we can hear some of the pathos of the reading. It's a poem kind of about youth, but you can kind of hear the age in his voice. So what do you want to say about this poem initially, upon first seeing it and hearing it? Leaving aside its metapoetic energy for the moment, let's just talk about kind of what we hear in the surface. So why does he say, though I'm no Catholic? Why does the poem begin that way? Max, though I'm no Catholic.
It's this great way of like sort of parrying the what might be kind of religious or sectarian about that title, right? So it's like the Catholic bells, and then he says, well, I'm not a Catholic, really. This just happens to be this phenomenon that I'm interested in. I don't have to be one of the believers, one of the inducted, in order to enjoy these bells.
I don't have to be Catholic in order to do what, literally, do we get in the second line, Emily?
To enjoy the sound of these bells, which typically have a very religious specific meaning.
And not just hear them, but not just listen, but listen hard. I mean, Amaris, what did anything strike you about that, listening hard? Why listen hard?
I guess it's because it's so often dismissed as a background noise if you think, oh, it's just the church bells calling people into prayer. But it seems to have more of a unifying effect. It collects all the disparate elements and people in his environment under this sort of imposing sound that he's enjoying.
So, moving through the poem, what kinds of scenes, what kind of objects, like what are we seeing here?
Back in the day, before people had things like newspapers and let's jump even further ahead, Twitter. It used to be that pretty much everything important was announced by bells, the time. Nice. That there was an impending attack, that someone had died, that someone had been born. Like all of these things were announced by the ringing of bells. But we've kind of lost that, right? Even from the 19th, 20th century onward, we don't have that anymore. Now we just have the ringing, the pure sound that ends up applying to all of these different situations.
So there's something about the ritual that's shifted in modern times.
And it's not just ringing, but it's like a lot of different kinds of ringing. Like there's ringing in, ringing out, ringing down. So the bells are actually, it's not just decorative, they're actually precipitating some kind of actions. Like they're ringing out the parrot under its hood, or ringing in Sunday morning. So it's not just William sitting, listening and looking. He's sort of like what you're saying about the bells, maybe having some kind of subjectivity, like they're precipitating some action.
Well, you're right, because all those prepositions, as they're added to the ringing, then make those actions the objects of the ringing.
Except later in the poem, he changes to 4. It's now become ring 4.
And that's really important. I want to come back to that, but I have two questions that your comments made me think of. Let them ring, only ring. So this is in the 5th stanza. Williams writes, let them ring, only ring. What strikes you, Molly, about let them ring, only ring? What does it mean to like ring, only ring in contrast to ring 4 or ring in?
I mean, to me, there's a little bit of urgency to it. You could substitute just for only and say just ring, and this will kind of create some kind of action.
So the other moment I wanted to come back to is in the second to last stanza when Williams writes, "Oh, bells, ring for the ringing." So let them ring, only ring, and oh, bells, ring for the ringing. Seems like 2 places where we're talking about ringing for the sake of ringing. Is there any difference between those, even in the micro level of the parts of speech you see? One has an one moment has an ing at the end, the other doesn't. What do you think, Matt?
There's a change in tone in that the first one, let them ring, only ring. There seems to be this it's kind of like an injunction, like this needs to, like there's this sort of urgency, right, to get back to kind of strip this sign away from all of this, like all of it that's signifying like the ritual stuff that you were saying. We get the sense here that the ritual hasn't quite dropped away, right? That he's saying like now is the time that we should really just take bells back to, we should just enjoy them for their sonic qualities. Whereas by the end here, it seems to have changed. Bells ring for the ringing. He seems almost to think that change has happened. Like that seems to be the progression that's happening over the course of the poem.
Well, because the way that, like, just sonically at the end of that poem, there's so many more ing sounds. So, like, ring for the ringing, it actually sounds much closer to ringing a bell than ring only ring, because it's like you've let it ring twice, because it's like two of those ing sounds, and then it just goes on to beginning, ringing, ring, Catholic bells.
And as
like
a gerund,
yeah.
Ringing is a noun, and you kind of get to this like no ideas but in things place, right? Where you're like, there's almost this reification of the ringing of the sound into this kind of aesthetic or poetic object.
And that gets ushered in by the direct address to the bells, "O bells," as opposed to "let them ring." That there's a certain amount of kind of grammatical distance to "let them ring."
Because "let them" is more like what kind of speech?
It's almost more religious, like let us pray, let us whatever.
That novena to Saint Anthony in the stanza, right? Who was Saint Anthony? Does anyone know?
Saint of Lost Things.
Lost things. Is that significant at all? Is there a sense of lost things in this poem?
I think so, because I think the what the bells mark is time passing, because there's so many cycles. I mean, at first you get the changing of seasons, but then you have the baby, and then right after that you have Sunday morning and old age, which adds as it takes away, and then you have the image of the young priest, which is right next to the image of the grape still hanging to the vines, like broken teeth in the head of an old man. So has that young priest become that old man? In "O bells, ring for the ringing," it's ring for the marking and noting of that passing of time, too.
It's also like the bells connect all of these different images together. All these different things are tied together through those bells. Those are what the democratizing force is.
When we talk about metapoetics in ModPo, what does that typically mean? What do we typically mean when we use that term, Amaris?
We're referencing how aspects of the poem's content and form are providing a commentary on how poems are written. It's commenting on itself.
Commenting on itself, maybe saying something about not just what poetry does, but also what poetry can do. So, what did you guys notice about the way Williams reads the end of this poem? That ring, 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 Catholic bells. What do you hear in his voice at that moment, and what do you see on the page?
I think kind of a longing in the tone, like the way that he reads it. Like, it maybe starts off as just a familiar word, ring, but then he draws out that ing sound in a way that makes it seem like longing, like he just really wants them to keep going.
And there's a way, yeah, Allie.
And it also enacts the sound of ringing, because the language is reduced to that sound. So it is ringing. It is repeatedly ringing. And even in the reading, it has that steady rhythm. And then it ends, Catholic bells.
And it's also the work, I think, there, finally at the end, of dissociating the word ring from its semantic meaning, right? So, like, if you say ring, 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 it becomes sound, as you were saying, Lily, right? And that is essentially the work that he wants to accomplish in this poem, right? Or that he's sort of idealizing or longing for. And it's just a matter, maybe, of repeating it, saying it again and again and again, until it just shakes free, all of that Catholicism.
It shakes through the Catholicism, but it also, I think, seems to shake free all the different ways, all the different things ring can mean. We've seen it as a command, we've seen it as other kinds of verbs. Do we see it as a noun ever? Or do we?
Well, ring for the ringing.
Yeah, ring for the ringing appears as a noun.
The ringing, yeah.
So one of the things that drops away is this idea that ring can be a specific part of speech, and there's something very specific about how it's being spoken. If what happens at the end of the poem is that the word ring becomes untethered from all of these previous meanings, is there something that the poem itself is doing by the end? Does the poem begin to do the work of the ringing? Does the poem become Catholic in that way? Is that what is metapoetic?
I sort of think
Catholic
of the rhythm of the poem as, because of the line breaks and the stanzas that we talked about before, I think of, when I was reading it, I was trying to think of, because he's writing it while he's listening to the bells, so I was thinking, what if I try to keep that sound of old church bells or whatever in the back of my head while I read it. And as I was doing that, I was thinking maybe the stanza breaks is where the bell, what do you call it, the clapper? Is that what it's
called?
Okay, yeah. The clapper is hitting the side of the bell at the stanza break, and then it's swinging, and then it hits again at the stanza break. So I think I think of it as Williams looking at the Catholic bells and what he sees in front of him as a model for what he wants poetry to be able to do, which is link things that aren't necessarily group things together in a democratic sort of way, and use that form of just the regular swinging, but looking out and seeing all the people called out and highlighted by the sound of the bells.
So it's amazing that even with a poem that we encounter on the page, we've been thinking a lot about sound across Madpo, we can still get that sense of the sound of the word taking us into the way language can turn a poem into a metapoetic commentary on experience.